I'm Sharon Percy Rockefeller, President and CEO of WETA. Proudly headquartered in Arlington's Shirlington neighborhood, we are your local PBS station and the second largest producer of programming for PBS. As an aside, I wanted to tell you that I have a personal connection with Arlington. Not only have I worked there every day for the last 30 years as CEO of WETA, but my mother and my father were married in the early 40s. My father was in the Navy, and they lived at 402 George Mason Drive when they first got married. So I've got an 80-year history with Arlington, although I've only been at WETA for 30 years. For nearly 60 years, WETA has served our community, creating and presenting public media programming and content that educates, inspires, and engages our audiences. Since our founding by local leaders and visionaries, including Arlington's own Elizabeth Campbell, we have pursued a mission of ardent public service, promoting lifelong learning in our community. That work continues in earnest today. My distinguished friend and colleague, University of Chicago alum David Brooks, and yes, I'm from Chicago, has offered illuminating insight and perspective on contemporary issues for decades as one of America's most prominent thought leaders. David has been an op-ed columnist for the New York Times since 2003. He has been a commentator for 20 years on our own WETA's national PBS NewsHour, produced here in Arlington. David's work with the Weave Project at the Aspen Institute promotes the power of relationships, community, and connection. He reminds us to be inspired to find our multiple commonalities and be kind and to care for one another, especially in these divisive times. Tonight, we will learn about 3 Arlington residents who exemplify the spirit behind David's Weave project. Thank you for joining us for this Arlington Reads conversation.
Well, thank you to Sharon Rockefeller. Thank you to WETA for supporting us today in this important conversation about how to build community. You know, this year, it's, I think, clear to everybody even more how important community is, but it's been so difficult with the pandemic. And in fact, we started out this year, Arlington, we're big on community. We've been doing it for a long time and trying to build community as things change. But this year, our theme for our book talks was We the People. And of course, the book talks, like everything else, changed quite a bit. But I think We the People is a wonderful theme for our this year, actually, our attempt to get through this year together, build a sense of community. And I'm really looking forward to the discussion with Mr. David Brooks today. And our wonderful director of our libraries is going to head it up, Diane Kresh. And Mark, why don't you tell us a little bit about Diane and her book talks that she gives.
Thank you very much, Libby. Diane Kresh has been our director of libraries since 2006, and we're lucky to have her. Starting in 2009, she had the Arlington Reads series. We've had some exciting authors: Richard Ford, Ann Patchett, Wendell Berry, Catherine Boo, Zadie Smith, Ann Patchett, just a very long list. And you can go on our website and see all the exciting authors that she has talked to. Diane's interviews are always provocative, and they raise a number of interesting questions. And so I know that when she wraps up at the end, we're going to come back to a conversation among the 3 of us, Libby, myself, and Diane. So I'm very excited to introduce Diane, who will be interviewing David Brooks. So see you all back here at the end of that interview. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Mark. I'm Diane Kresh, Director of Arlington Public Library, and it's my pleasure to be with you this evening. The theme of Arlington Reads 2020 was We the People, and we planned a series of conversations with 5 preeminent authors to discuss race, identity, and immigration, to explore whether as Americans we share a national story, and to help us understand what our duties and responsibilities are or should be to one another. Then the pandemic happened. And while some of these conversations have been postponed until 2021, the past 7 months have given us the opportunity to think about just that. What does community look like, and how does it behave during a pandemic? The pandemic has laid bare the inequities of our society, from food and internet access to housing and health. And it's made us reassess what essential work is, as unheralded workers are putting their own health and safety on the line so we can find some semblance of normalcy. Think of your grocery cashiers, your sanitation workers, the delivery and bus drivers, and of course, our EMTs. And the pandemic has raged against a backdrop of deep polarization in our society, pursuit of zero-sum games where we declare winners and losers, widespread mistrust of our institutions, and a prevalent feeling of life being lived in, as psychoanalyst Viktor Frankl put it, an existential vacuum. The pandemic has also brought out some of the best of us in our community, in our generosity, our empathy, our unceasing energy. We've bagged and brought groceries to neighbors in need. We've called seniors and isolated individuals to check on their well-being. And we've donated our time and our resources so that we could get through this together. And even though we don't know when the pandemic will end, we do know it will. The connections we've established, the relationships that we've built, the care that we've offered one another is important now more than ever. And to show how we can harness this trust that we've built and how to build a more robust, empathetic community is author David Brooks. Welcome, David.
It's great to be with you.
Many of us know you from your New York Times op-ed columns, and then before that, the Wall Street Journal columns. And I know you best for your appearances on the weekly NewsHour, which for me is appointment television. You're sparring with Mark Shields each week. I have on my desk, and no point in reading it, but it's an op-ed that you wrote in May of 2015, and it's called "What's Your Purpose?" And I was wondering if you could set the stage. What were you thinking about at the time that made you go through a personal journey, if you will, a personal development process, personal examination, and led you to where you are today? You published 2 books, The Road to Character and The Second Mountain, which we can refer to later. And of course, we have them in Arlington Library. But please tell us where you were mentally and emotionally about 6 or 7 years ago.
Yeah, I guess professionally, I had achieved way more career success than I ever thought I would. I had got to work at the New York Times and the NewsHour and various places. And I learned that career success helps you avoid any anxiety you might feel if you felt yourself a failure, but it doesn't give you that much positive happiness. And along the way, I had neglected my relationships. I had neglected my friendships in particular. And so at about that time, my kids were leaving home to go to college, or were about to, or had. My marriage had ended. I was living alone in an apartment on Wisconsin Avenue. And I realized that I had a lot of work friends, people I could go to lunch with and talk politics. I didn't have a lot of great weekend friendships, the kind that are actually friendships, who were the people you're actually intimate and close with. And so the moment was symbolized for me in my apartment was I was working all the time. I was like any idiot who tries to work their way through an emotional problem and a spiritual problem. And if you went to my kitchen and pulled open the drawers where there should have been forks and knives for guests, I had Post-it notes. And where there should have been plates for guests, I had envelopes and stuff like that, stationery supplies. And so that's a misled life. And so I decided that I would, try to change my life in a way that was deeper and more relational and more community oriented. So I wrote 2 books. One, The Road to Character, which is about how do you lead a moral life. And then The Second Mountain is really how do you lead a relational life. And those books were not they were part of the solution. They were not the whole solution. Actually leading a life dedicated to commitments was part of the solution. And I'm not perfect. I still tend to shrink away sometimes from deep emotional bonds. But I'm a lot better than I was, and it's a sign. It was a sign to me that a life can change pretty dramatically at any stage in life if you choose to throw yourself into it.
Now, earlier this month, you published a piece in The Atlantic, America and Its Moral Convulsion. And I also saw a tweet from you later that said it was the hardest thing you ever had to write. And so tell us a little bit about what the moral convulsion is, and do we find our way out of it?
Yeah, so it turns out I wasn't the only one going through a crisis of relationships. Our whole country is going through it, and that's been evident for a few years with the rising depression rates, the rising suicide rates. But it's been super present this year in 2020, and I was helped thinking about 2020. It was a super confusing year to think about because so much was going on. But Samuel Huntington, a Harvard political scientist, wrote a book in 1981 on the politics of disharmony. And he said every 60 years, America goes through a moral convulsion. These are periods when people are indignant about the way things are. They have lost faith in systems. They've lost faith in each other. A new moral generation comes along the scene. Outsider groups want to get inside. And so he says we have these convulsions. We had it in the 1770s, 1830s, 1890s with the progressive era, in the 1960s and all that. And he predicted in 1981 that we'd probably have one around 2020. And lo and behold, we had this convulsion. We could have come together in COVID, and we did not. And the crisis manifests itself as a crisis of trust, that we don't trust each other. We don't trust our institutions. And so it's the same process that I was going through, but on a national scale. And it's how do you take isolation, distrust, and create some sense of trust and relationship and mutual commitment and community? And that's really the challenge for all of us.
Right. So Viktor Frankl has a phrase for what I believe you're describing called an existential vacuum. And I'm the mom of two millennial-aged boys, 28 and 32. Mark Schwartz has a couple of daughters in that age cohort. Libby Garvey, our county board chair, has grandchildren. So we're all boomers. And what can we do to encourage this generation of, I'd say, pretty activist? I mean, people who are looking for purpose and looking for something to identify with. What encouragement can we give them to help them either be more of who they are, or in fact reach that second mountain that you talked about in your second book?
Yeah, I would say one thing we boomers can do is let them learn from our successes and let them learn from our failures. I think over the course of the boomer generation, we've made life fairer than it used to be. Fairer for women, fairer for African Americans, fairer for Jews, fairer for a lot of groups. Not all the way there, but progress has been made. Our failures derive from maybe the flip side of our success, which was we're a pretty individualistic generation. Starting in the 1960s, the songs were about liberation. People felt hemmed in. They felt they were too conformist. They felt too constrained. And so the songs are free bird. I'm a rambling man. I'm born to run.
Right.
And so if you look at the central boomer story, it's the story of liberation. And we've taken 60 years and we've had 60 years of individualism, which has been great for the liberation of individuals. It's not been great for the connections between people. And when I look at Gen Z and millennials, I look at a generation, as you say, super morally passionate, super committed to community in a way maybe people 20 years ago weren't, but still distrustful, still having grown up in an era that has let them down, the financial crisis, war, Donald Trump. And so helping cross-generation, all of us, to find trusting organizations. I think it's organizations and institutions are the key. We learn to trust each other when we work together in community groups, and we drive places together. We do projects together. We show up at meetings together. It's by the daily acts of community life that trust gets rebuilt.
And of course, when we're living in a pandemic, it makes the relationship building that much harder. And of course, I worry about the amount of time each of us spends on social media and tend to define ourselves by how many likes we have, what our reach is, how many thousands of people our tweets reach. Sadly, my tweets reach nobody, but that's okay. But there was another phrase that you used, I heard in an interview: ratchet, hatchet, pivot, ratchet. And is that a term that also applies to this era that we're in? And if so, where on the spectrum of those four are we?
Yeah, this is not my term. I forgot who, a political scientist at Tufts, I think. And she argues that history moves forward by what she calls ratchet, hatchet, pivot, ratchet. And basically what happens is a country confronts a problem. In the 1960s, it was civil rights, it was feminism, we had or sexism, we had these problems. And we created a culture to solve it. And we made some progress, so we ratcheted it up. But then the culture we created sort of stopped working, too individualistic. So we have to chop up the old culture and pivot over and create another new culture, and then we'll ratchet up again.
Right.
And she says those moments of hatcheting when we have to tear up what we built because we need something new, those are bumpy. And we're in the middle of a bumpy moment. But the theory puts great faith in our ability to figure stuff out. And I guess I share that faith.
So let's talk a little bit about the WEAVE program and where the WEAVE concept, how did you hit on that? What was driving that aha moment of creating that?
Yeah, well, I was writing all these columns and they all came down to social isolation and disconnection, which we've been talking about. And I thought this is the core problem underlying a lot of our problems, underlying polarization, underlying a lot of economic problems and lack of social mobility. And I realized it's being solved at the local level by people I call weavers, who are really good at building relationship. So we thought, why don't we lift them up? Why don't we tell their stories? Why don't we illuminate them so the rest of the world can see, oh, that's a better way to live. Our theory is you got to change culture, and to change culture, culture changes when a small group of people find a better way to live and the rest of us copy them. And so we go around the country and we plop ourselves down, whether it's in the Englewood neighborhood in Chicago or Wilkes, North Carolina, rural America, and we say, who's trusted here? And we learn, we run away, we run across 75 people who are active in the community, who are making that community work. For example, there's a guy named Pancho Arguelles in Houston. He takes undocumented immigrants who've been paralyzed while working on construction sites, and he gets them diapers and catheters and wheelchairs so they can lead dignified lives. Then he turns them into social workers. So you'll be in your neighborhood in Houston and 60 Latino guys in wheelchairs will roll into your neighborhood to help your community. And that's what they do. They just rush to the hurricane. They see a problem and they're just phenomenal at building relationships. And somehow we all should aspire to be a little more like that. Don't have to be heroic like Pancho, but we can be a little more communal in just our daily lives.
Well, it seems that people too are striving for that kind of community connection. When I grew up in the 60s, we knew everybody in the neighborhood. We had parties and barbecues together. If I went out to play, I could be assured that all of the other mothers were looking out for each of us. And we don't have that sense of connectedness now. And so we want to take a couple of minutes to talk about the weavers that we've identified here in Arlington. So let's just take a quick look and then we'll talk for a minute afterwards.
Arlington Weaves is a place where people with disabilities can come and they can express themselves artistically and creatively. This partnership with ServiceSource and Arlington County really helps develop people individually and in the community.
They're referred here through DHS, the Department of Human Services. They produce handcrafted items such as tote bags, scarves, small pouches, lunch totes, placemats, tea towels, small coin purses. And when our items sell, the participant that makes that particular item gets 100% of the proceeds.
Today is special because we have a group from Notre Dame, and they're here with a program that brings them into L'Arche, which is a group home that a couple of our participants are a part of. And they're actually here to visit Lori because it's Lori's birthday soon, and they've all really become good friends with Lori in the past few days.
Oh, you're all picked out. You're ready for Lori?
They come here to see me. My favorite thing is placemat, the tote bag.
The program at Arlington Weaves helps build confidence and self-esteem amongst the individuals because It not only gives them a sense of independence when they can choose the colors and the types of patterns that they want to build, but then it also helps them to earn the paycheck and to receive some sort of payback for their artistry.
It's a very rewarding feeling to know that our artists are recognized as artists throughout the local community here. And just seeing them transition from learning how to initially warp a loom into actually creating a piece of product that sells is just the best feeling ever. And for them to come in and say, Sharon, I got a check in the mail. And they're so excited. Really makes me excited that I took them through that journey.
I feel so wonderful to be here so I can make a glitter my own special style.
I'm a recovering serious-aholic and perfectionist, so when I can laugh at myself, I am good to go. Very good. Yay! I'm Diane Lynn Cohen. I'm an executive and career coach with Coaching to Connect. And what brings me here today, which I'm very grateful and appreciative for, is that I'm a certified laughter yoga leader and a laughter ambassador. There's 4 elements. There's clapping, there's childlike playfulness, and there's the pranayama breathing, which is the yoga piece. We don't do poses, we laugh and we breathe a lot. Laughter yoga is laughing for no reason. It's a unique concept, there are no jokes. We laugh at ourselves. Its mission is world peace. So many people are mocked or laughed at or put down or treated cruelly. And so when we laugh at ourselves and not at other people, it's a wonderful tool. I've learned so many lessons. I think one of the greatest is resilience and how laughter contributes to that, because when you start to laugh at yourself or at the problem, you can bounce back and gain your power. Ho, ho, ha, ha, ha. Ho, ho, ha. It boosts our immunity. It's non-political, non-competitive, non-judgmental, and it helps with stress. Throw our stress into the middle of the room and we run to the middle of the room and we stomp on them. I realized that community was happening. The first night, 30 people showed up. And then I did it at the Washington National Cathedral and 60 people showed up. When we could laugh together, it was just a wonderful sense of community. A strong community is built of like-minded people. They're people who enjoy the common interest and they show up, they contribute, and they're willing to be kind. And keep laughing!
Part of my mental health and sanity was really driven by me locking in to the initiative from day one. My name is David Guas, and I'm the chef and owner of Bayou Bakery, Coffee Bar, and Eatery in Arlington, Virginia. Chefs Feeding Families essentially is an initiative that we launched just 3 days after learning that all the schools were going to be closed. And it's in partnership with Real Food for Kids, which is a nonprofit here in Northern Virginia. The women that I employ were directly affected, their families and their children, by this shutdown. And it was really my wife saying, you got to do something. Because I came home that day telling her about, my team and their kids. And oh my God, how are they going to get meals? The fact that I was able to lock into something early on, even not even knowing what was happening with my own business, gave me a sense of purpose and direction and really kind of helped me stay grounded. So for me, it was about how do I navigate again? Well, I put a wooden spoon in my hand, I started stirring beans. Beans and rice, a staple for so many different cultures, and also an inexpensive food source with actually a lot of nutrients. So it was kind of like we checked all the boxes and just went for it. We've been in business now for 10 years, and it really wasn't until the pandemic and the beginning of it that I truly started to feel connected.
Bye.
I often always refer to that I'm in Arlington County, and now I kind of talk about that I'm in the Arlington community. I think that learning lessons, I think just being kinder to people, not being so busy. It feels like it puts certain things in perspective for me. For the most part, they're all good though. Good lessons and ones that I will keep with me for the rest of my life.
There are children here in Arlington County who are not getting the full benefit of the quality of education that's available.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Cherise Kearns.
My name is Cherise Kearns. I am co-chair of the NAACP Education Committee and a founding member of Black Parents of Arlington. I am an advocate for educational equity here in Arlington County. What we'd like is to eventually have a school system where race, ethnic background, income level, or disability status isn't a predictor of your level of success or your potential. An important part of equity is understanding who's missing, whose voices are missing, and trying to get those voices to the table. And if I'm constantly bumping into walls, and why should I continue? Every time I get to that point, I get some sort of bubble that tells me about the why. So, someone will come up to me and say, Cherise, I really appreciate the work you're doing. Or, we'll get news out of APS of some innovation that they've done where you can look at it and you can say, this is what we've been pushing for. So, there'll be a little piece of progress that inspires me to continue with this work. A strong community is built from trust. I think it comes from great communication and I think transparency. And we need to be able to love one another. I mean the kind of love where it drives you to action. I feel optimistic. I think that there are some changes happening in APS that are very intentional, and I think that they're going to ultimately be beneficial to minority communities, and I'm excited about that.
In viewing them, what stood out to you as characteristics of a weaver?
Well, I mean, they're all weavers because they're all joining people together for a common cause. But I guess, for David saw a problem and it hit him in the face. He didn't actually go out looking for it. It's just, how's my team doing? How do they feed their kids? How are other people feeding their kids? And so he just responded to the problem. And I find weavers do that. It's not like they say, well, I'm going to sit down and be a weaver. There's a problem and they need to respond, or in some cases, something bad happens to them. They lose a child and they don't want it to happen to other people. And so they form an organization that'll maybe help prevent teenage depression and kids taking their own lives. Mm-hmm. And so what David did is there was a felt need and he just responded. And what's beautiful about that story is that he feels he's deeper into the neighborhood than he ever was. He was on the block, but he's not in the block. And so he's had his life transformed by this. And that's what so happens often, is that you're leading a different kind of life. Suddenly you take on these burdens, and by taking on burdens, you lighten your life.
Right. And what strikes me too is that it's simple, kind of basic steps when you step back, one person, one neighborhood, one initiative at a time, but the cumulative effect can bring about real transformation. My favorite moment in David's video was when he said, I saw there was a problem before us and I grabbed a big spoon and he started making the beans and rice. And I thought that was just perfect. We also had the laughing yoga. Thoughts about that?
Yeah, I forget her phrase, Diane's phrase. She used to be a perfectionist and then a serious-aholic or something like that. And so what's beautiful about that is she's emerging from her own reality, that she had this problem. She was a perfectionist. She probably didn't laugh enough. And so she figures out a solution and she shares it. And there's this interest for it. The number of people who showed up at the meeting, the number of people who showed up at the National Cathedral. There is a hunger in this country for forms of community, for forms of intimacy, for forms of emotional sharing that is often unmet in everyday life. And so somebody like her who just radiates transparency, there's a hunger for that. And I find as I go around the country, when you really think about what weavers are doing, they're making people feel felt. They're making people feel seen. And at the core of every successful community or organization or family is the ability to know other people and be deeply known yourself.
Sure.
And we don't teach that in schools, but she has it in abundance.
What I also liked about her, she sort of surrendered the ego. She even sort of at one point, it was less about me and being kind to others and seeing others and making that possible. And just the way she ended it, be kind and laugh. I mean, how many times do we think about laughing at ourselves? We don't like to do that. And that sense of ego-less, is that also true, a characteristic of the weaver?
For sure. They live lives their lives are not about self. Their lives really are about service, and they take on a lot of burdens, and sometimes there's risk of burnout. But the thing that they also share often is what she has is the ability to be vulnerable and childlike.
Right.
And I hope if I were around her, I'd be uninhibited enough to actually do the silly stuff. But but to lead people in that way is a way of just breaking down the adult incrustations that built up around our personalities.
Absolutely right. We've all got these protective shells, which are in many cases decades old and hardened over. She does classes for the library, actually, and I'm told that it's fun and infectious. I don't even like yoga, so I'm not sure I'm going to join in, but it looked like an incredible release. And then the third person is Cherise Kearns, and she is active in education and advocating for Black students in particular. Thoughts about her piece and her work?
Yeah, I mean, what brings communities together? It's common loves, and one of the things a community loves in common is their kids. Mm-hmm. And so working through the school system, and this is something I want to celebrate about her. It's easy to have like this informal gathering, but the health of our society is based on our institutions. Right. Based on the structures, whether it's governmental, the county government, or the school system. And so continually improving the school systems and reforming them is the work. And I think a lot of people have lost faith in institutions. They say, oh, they don't work. Institutions don't work. I'm anti-institutional. But we have to make them work because that's what we live in. That's what we get educated within. So her going to meetings, advocating for African-American kids is a way, A, to make the school system better, and B, to restore the core problem that our nation has been wrestling with for centuries.
Right. She also talks a lot about people asking her, do you ever get tired of advocating for this issue? And do you ever feel like hitting the wall? And she says, when I do, I think about the why, and the why as opposed to the how. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of the why and the grounding of the why?
Yeah, one of the things I find about weavers is that they do get tired because the work is sometimes very hard, but they tend not to give up. I've never met one who said, I'm going to do this for a couple of years and then I'll go off and do something else. They know why they were placed on this earth, and they are driven by that sense of not by money and status, but by a need to feel right with the world, that they are serving a moral purpose. Their motivations tend to be moral motivations rather than material motivations. And she seems like an example of that.
And she also talks about, again, the importance of love. I mean, just loving each other. And again, some of us feel, I'm somebody for whom, if somebody were to call me a lover, I'd be horrified. A strong leader, et cetera. But we tend to shy away from those terms. And I think that's another example of shying away from our intimacy and our willingness to be vulnerable and to get too close to other people. And these folks don't seem to have that problem.
Yeah, I would say it's a problem unique, or not unique, but especially in the Washington, D.C. metro area, that somehow we draw the most, including myself, the most emotionally avoidant people on the face of the earth. And we talk about systems, and we want to talk about public life and politics and the law and other things. But we're not as good sometimes at talking about the intimacies. And this is a problem with our school system, is that for decades, and in many places, not in all, they've treated kids as brains on a stick.
Right.
And they haven't treated the whole emotional, social, the whole child. And so, but education is fundamentally about the love between a teacher and a student. You don't learn from people you don't have some affection for and don't want to please and don't want to earn their respect. And so reintroducing that into schools is super important work.
I remember some of the teachers that I had over the decades and how in many cases they really saved me from myself when I didn't even know I needed saving. So it's an important relationship. And again, one I worry about as we are doing more social distancing and not as available in the classroom as we might be. It challenges us to think of more ingenious ways of connecting. I want to talk too, I believe Cherise also mentioned the concept of trust. And we've talked about a diminishing of trust in our institutions, in our in our communities, and again, the role of trust when it's absent. How do we rebuild it?
Yeah, well, that's I did this big long piece about trust for the Atlantic, and I talked to all these social scientists. They all said, we know a lot about how trust is destroyed. We don't know how it's built because it hasn't been built in a long time. And, we have lost faith in our institutions and in each other. If you talk to young adults and you ask them, can most people be trusted? They'll 20% say, yeah, most people can be trusted. Most do not believe people can be trusted. And it's super hard to do business deal if you don't trust the other person. It's super hard to build an organization. It's super hard to spontaneously build a culture. But I do think trust, when it has been rebuilt, and the best historical example is in the 1890s when people built, first they had a shift in culture from a very individualistic culture to a more communal one. Then they had a civic renaissance. They created all these organizations in the 1890s, the Boys and Girl Scouts, the Boys and Girls Clubs, the temperance movement, the settlement house movement, the NAACP, the unions. So just one organization after another just got built, suffragettes, and all at once. And so it was within those organizations that trust was built up and community was reestablished. And then later they had the progressive movement, which cleaned up government. And so you can do it, but I do think you have to work on common projects together and see each other. Trust is the ratio between the number of times you've been betrayed and the number of times you haven't been betrayed, when people have actually kept their promises.
Sure.
And you've got to put yourself in situations where people are making and keeping their promises to one another. And then people then say, oh yeah, the world is a trustworthy place.
Right. The line between advocacy, maybe assertive advocacy, and tribalism, which you've described in a couple of your writings, and weaving, is that a difficult line to keep separate? I mean, when does tribalism become the thing, as opposed to I'm working on behalf of a group I'm a part of, and I'm working for a greater good? Is there tension between those two?
Yeah, they can blend into each other when threat arises. But to me, community is love of a common thing, like love of Arlington County. We just love our place and we want to serve it. Tribalism is hatred of another. And so if you were joining because you love Arlington County, that's community. If you're joining because you hate Montgomery County, that's tribalism. And so often a lot of our groupings are not based on mutual love, but on a shared hatred of something else. Mm-hmm. And one grows out of an abundance mentality, community does, that there's enough for all. If we can all thrive, I have my community, you have yours, there's enough for all. The other grows out of a scarcity mentality, which is not enough for all. And if I've got to grab mine because they're going to grab it first.
Yeah.
And so it's really that basic mindset shift.
Yeah, sort of the zero sum, the tragedy of the commons. I'm looking out for me first and my interests, and I need to get there first, or there won't be any for me. We are Arlington County. We are a government, and we are interested in growing more weavers. We identified a handful in the community. I also forgot to mention the nonprofit that we also featured, and that's a nonprofit that gives basically work for developmentally and intellectually underdeveloped adults, and gives them a sense of purpose and dignity, a way to give back to the community through weaving. And they create woven products, and when it's not COVID, we actually have a store and we sell them. And so now we're trying to do is have each of them have a loom in their home so that they continue to have that sense of purpose and connectedness. But getting back to the government, we're a government and we're interested in improving the social fabric. And what role, if any? You talked about institutions earlier, local governments or institutions. How can they catalyze weaving so that we can be better together?
Well, first, in my travels, I live in DC, and when in my travels to any county, even a neighboring area, let alone across in Nebraska or Louisiana, the local governments are always so much healthier. And the relationships between the people within working in the governments and serving the governments is just a lot healthier than, say, in the United States Congress. So that's already a step up. I do think government can do things. Government can't build a lot of the relationships that are trusting relationships. Those are built between people, but government can set the table.
Yeah.
Government can use the schools first as a place to emphasize that a school is a community, not just a factory for knowledge, but also using the schools as hubs for the surrounding communities with wraparound services and things like that.
Right.
And then government can set a place, even physical places, a park or something like that, can clean up a place, can create a meeting ground. Right. Government can also reward service and either subsidize or somehow provide hosts for people who do want to start communities. I was at a place in Detroit where they've taken an old abandoned school, which they've got a lot of in Detroit, and they've just made it sort of it would be a tech hub, but it's for nonprofits. Sure. And they all are in this big school and they all are interacting, and the people in the neighborhood were suspicious at first because they didn't know what was happening. And now they're enthusiastic because they've got a community center.
Right.
And so there are a lot of ways government can set the table for these kinds of relationships.
I'm thinking too with schools, there's been a lot of talk about bringing back classes in civics. I mean, just basic, how do we live and work together in community, and how do we bring about change and not leave everything to the highest levels of legislatures or state governments. In the Atlantic article, again, you called out Houston, Texas. So I'm curious, what stands out with Houston, and what do they have that we don't?
Yeah, well, Arlington may have it. They're not dissimilar. I mean, if you go to, I'm from New York City, I grew up there, and if you go to New York, you know where the Midtown is, you know where the center of the thing is. If you go to Houston, you don't know where the center. There's no center. They've got a lot of different centers, and Houston is the most diverse city in America. It's got 120 languages, I think, spoken in the school system. And what they've got is I just don't think we're going to be centralized the way we were when we were like basically a white Protestant country. We're going to be a more diverse, pluralistic country. We're not going to quite have a center. But in Houston, they have a lot of different centers. And you drive through Houston, and sometimes you feel like you're in Lagos, Nigeria. Sometimes you feel like you're in Vietnam. Sometimes you feel like you're in China. There's just all these little ethnic enclaves. And the thing they have is they welcome you in. And so if you move there, and believe me, I'm not a huge fan of the city because it's kind of ugly, but if you move there, they welcome you in. They don't ask you about your past. They ask you about your future. Mm-hmm. And there's a reigning atmosphere of goodwill. And so even with all the diversity, there's goodwill, I would say, toward each other. And Arlington County is like this. It's obviously got tremendous diversity. It's got tremendous income diversity. And it's got different centers. But what Houston proves, and maybe Arlington too, that you can be really diverse and decentralized and still have a sort of a coherent culture to it, a coherent identity that, this is who we are here.
I think that's one of the things that we want to be pursuing. You talk a lot about what is the national story. I'd like us to think about what is our community story. Does everybody see themselves in that community story? And if not, why not? We are going to be launching a series of race and equity dialogues across the community, some of it born out of recent events with Black Lives Matter and some of the police shootings, but also just to get more in touch with our community and who's benefiting, who isn't, and how do we know? And I think, again, celebrating stories like the Weavers, like we did today, is a good step along with some of these other steps that we're taking. Again, I've heard you interviewed a number of times, and you've talked about being a bookish sort. I'm also a bookish sort, being a librarian. So curious, not necessarily on this topic, but what's on your nightstand? What are you most excited about reading currently?
Well, I'm trying to understand the skill of knowing others and being known. Like that, how do you do that? And so I've been reading a lot of psychology, and so I just finished a book named Mind by Daniel Siegel. He did another book called The Developing Child: How a Child Develops Intellectually, so that's on my nightstand. I've just finished a book. Some books are really rereading by Antonio Damasio, a neuroscientist out at USC, who studies people who've suffered lesions in their brain, and they can't process emotion. You show them a horrible picture and they know they should feel shocked by it, but they just can't process emotion. And you would think those people are super smart Mr. Spocks because they're so rational and logical, but they're incomparable. They can't do life because what our emotions do, they don't distract from reason. They assign value to things. Okay. And if you don't know what the value of something is, then you can't make a decision about it. And so he shows that emotions are really the undergirding of reason, not the opposite of reason.
And you've also spoken of the role of the soul, the heart, the mind, the soul. What do you mean when you talk about the soul? You're not necessarily talking in a religious or formal religious sense.
Yeah, I just observe the fact that I've never met a human being who didn't want to do good. And even people who do really bad things, and I've interviewed people who've criminals and war criminals and terrible dictators, they want to tell you a story about how they're a good person. And so the lesson I draw from that is that there's some piece of you that has no weight or size or color or shape, but it gives you infinite value and dignity. Right. And every human being has infinite value and dignity because they have that piece of them in them. And it doesn't require you to believe in God. We all know that we have this piece, and we're not equal in our brain power. We're not equal in our muscle power, but we're equal at the level of soul. We're all equal. Right. And what the soul does, in my view, is it yearns for goodness. We want to do something that serves something, some ideal. And so I just observe people, and you can be a person of faith or not, but I would ask you to believe that you have a soul and that everybody else around you has a soul. And if you treat them as if they have souls, you'll probably end up treating them reasonably well.
Yeah, better, certainly. And what about the role of libraries in sustaining community, telling the community story, supporting weavers?
Yeah, well, libraries, I've never seen an institution that has so successfully transformed itself in the face of new conditions. It's not only about books anymore. Libraries all around the country are the absolute sources of community. And I have a friend, Eric Kleinenberg, who calls them cathedrals for the people.
Right.
And I was talking to him, he's a sociologist, and he says, if we didn't have libraries, would we have the courage to build them? Are we the kind of society who would build libraries, would build these fabulous community centers that are now doing a million different things? And he said, I'm not sure we would. We don't seem to be good at building things anymore. Right. And thank God we have them, but it should inspire us, the creation of libraries. And people think of Andrew Carnegie, but mostly it was it was government libraries.
Right.
It should inspire us to think about, well, what can we build now, or how can we take libraries a step further? Because it shows that we don't have to be hopeless. The solutions are potentially around us.
Mm-hmm. Well, certainly Arlington Library System began just as you described. It was a bunch of individuals. It was women in garden clubs and book clubs and cooking clubs who felt that children needed some activity after school to keep from being in trouble. So they very deliberately set about to create the neighborhood system that we still have today. I also wanted to ask you about Paddington Bear, who apparently had a very significant impact on your life. You read Paddington Bear when you were 7 and decided to be a writer. So what was it about the bear?
It's funny, I went back and reread that book about 2 years ago, and I was a little shocked by it because It's a sad book. It's about this bear who comes from Peru and doesn't have a family. He's stuck at a train station in England, and suddenly a family sweeps him up and takes him in. And I thought, wow, what kind of kid was I that this really struck me? But mostly it was the act of really enjoying a book. And I thought, well, I would love to write that. I'd like to create that. And so I started writing, and it's been 50 years, and probably 200 days have not gone by where I haven't written or prepared to write. So that's been my life. That's what I do. And I shouldn't tell you this story, but when I was in high school, my friends and I were out at 2 a.m. and we thought we'd do something daring, that seemed daring. So we broke into our local library. And once we got inside, we just ran around and then left. But you're a bookish person when your act of high school daring do is to break into a library. We didn't steal any books. We were fine.
I love that story, and it might appear in our end of the year report. Turning back one final time to the Atlantic article, you talk about let's see, the beauty. I'm going to find the quote here. The beauty in the storm. The beauty in the storm in the midst of moral convulsion. And what hope do you have that we're going to find those spots of beauty in the storm?
Yeah, well, I think it is the Weavers. I've spent the last 3 years with them, and it's been a tough political season. But they have lifted me up every time. Just amazing people. Some who've been through the worst things you can imagine. There's a woman named Sarah Atkins I met outside of Columbus, Ohio, who her husband killed their kids and himself. And she's been through the worst you can imagine. But she now is a teacher. She now has a free pharmacy because she's a pharmacist. She now helps women who suffered from violence. And so you are around her, and she says, I'm not fully stable. This has been 3 or 4 years, but it's horrible. And yet it's a life of service. And so you are around these people, and you see Richard Rohr, who's a Franciscan monk, says he has a phrase, a bright sadness. And they're not blind to the problems of society, but there's a brightness about them. And so those people lift them up, and we've just seen some videos of people like that. And so you have some basic faith, and I found they're everywhere. It's not like they're rare; they're everywhere, and so that's what gives me hope.
So we will leave it there. It's been a delightful conversation with you, David Brooks, and we will let our readers know that let's see, it's weareweavers.org is your foundation, and we appreciate, again, the work that you're doing, the work that you have been doing, opening our minds to the importance of love and friendship and relationships, and most of all, having a bias toward action, even if it's a small step, one person, one neighborhood at a time. So as I thank you again on behalf of all of Arlington, stay well, stay safe, and stay hopeful. Thank you, David.
So thank you, and I can't wait till I can get back to Shirlington, where we do the news hour, and just enjoy Northern Virginia again.
Yes, yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, that was terrific. And I'm here now again with Libby and Mark, Libby Garvey and Mark Schwartz. And David certainly gave us a lot to think about. So before we start about next steps and where do we go from here, can you tell me, please, what a couple of the key takeaways were? Libby, let's start with you.
Yeah, sure. I think I loved in so much this, in a way, it was complex, but it was simple. My big takeaway was kindness, how important kindness is. Right. And I think we're seeing that more and more. So that was a great takeaway.
Simple acts of kindness. And how about you, Mark?
Yeah, so listening to it, one thing that struck me personally was, though I don't think my life is quite like this, but it echoed this concept of opening up the drawer where your cutlery is and seeing all these Post-it notes. To me, that speaks to making sure you have balance. And I think that that's something that I need to work on. And I think later on, or at one point, he commented about how people in Washington, D.C. sort of are always focused on those kinds of things, the work. And so bringing that balance in is what really stuck with me.
Right. Well, that kind of launched him on the journey. He was stuck on the first mountain of success and then realized how empty he felt. So, Libby, he also talked about the value of institutions. We're local government. We are an institution. We are a player in transformation. So what do you think? What do you think of the idea of institutions and the role they play?
I love what he talked about, government setting the table.
Right.
Because I mean, and let's face it, government is how people organize themselves in societies. If we're talking about community, you've got to have a government of some sort. And I think his point about setting the table, we're supposed to set the circumstances for people to thrive and to make sure that we make sure everyone thrives, which, and I know we'll get into it later. That's part of the whole deal with systemic racism, because sometimes government sets the table and some people get to the table and some people don't. But I really love that kind of analogy.
Right. And of course, I've got to throw a plug in for libraries. He called us what? Civic cathedrals?
Yes.
So that's now going to go on our website, our new tagline. The other part of it that really struck me was, of course, the features on our own weavers. We have the DHS Arlington weavers, and then we had the three who were featured yesterday in the conversation between the two of us. We have Diane Cohen, the Laughing Yoga, David Guas, who is the chef and owner of Bayou Bakery, and then finally Cherise Kearns and the work she does on behalf of Black Parents of Arlington. So what struck you about their stories?
Well, let me start on that. And I think that I'm simply going to be repeating what David Brooks said, which is the willingness of individuals to step up and try to make a difference, and the effort that it required. And I think that the fact that people just have to keep going at it, and he said, I think about weavers generally, once they start, they never stop. Right. And I think of each of those individuals and a whole host of other members of our community, that literally when you start, it doesn't take energy away from you. It gives you energy. At the same time, you're helping the community. That's absolutely true. How about you, Libby?
Yeah, no, I really loved the fact that they were sort of ordinary people, extraordinary, ordinary people. And I think that's part of the theme. It's really wonderful. And I think it keeps us all going. I think particularly by the time you get to a certain age, many of us have tried, when you go through a hard time, I think everybody finds if you can not focus on yourself and the difficulties you're having, but focus on helping others, you feel so much better. You feel so much better.
Well, and Brooks talks a lot about that. You're surrendering the ego in service to other people. And all of those folks hit those notes of love and kindness and reaching out, and it's not about me. And I thought each of those stories was incredibly powerful. So let's talk about how we can grow more weavers, because they have demonstrated that really anyone can be a weaver. And we have a series of race and equity conversations that we're launching in the community, and we're expecting those to be both challenging but ultimately transforming conversations. So how can we link these concepts of growing weavers and challenging racism in our community? Mark, do you want to start?
Yeah, this is something I've been thinking about, especially since I got to listen to the interview you had with David Brooks. Having the conversations about diversity and race and equity, they are not easy things to do. We're asking people to literally open themselves up and say, here are some problems I have and concerns, and it's very taxing and will be very emotional for a lot of people. And I'm not going to pretend to speak for all the people who participate in it, but I will tell you that I think at the end of the day, reaching an understanding on an intellectual level, I think, is important. But unless you tie it with actual acts of kindness, right, and acts of giving to the community, at the end of the day, unless we do that, we will really thought through the problem really well, but we will not have really changed the community. So I think marrying up the tough conversations with actual actions on the part of every individual, I think is going to be a real challenge for us. And I think it's something that we'll need to figure out how to incorporate better into the DRE dialogues.
Right. How about you, Libby?
Yeah, I'm thinking about how our colleague Christian Dorsey, when he talks about these conversations, says that, these are difficult conversations. And because you tend to only have them with people who are kind of in your own bubble, if you will, people that you are comfortable with, that you have similar views with. You don't sit down and talk about racism with somebody that you don't know and don't really know where they're coming from, or they come from a different place. And that's the table we're trying to set here,
Right.
is to bring people together. And part of the reason, I think sometimes people might say, well, people just need to talk. Give us some questions and we'll just talk. Well, the fact is, I think, as Mark talked about, this is difficult.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's going to be a little painful. And so the point is not, which is kind of typically Arlington and about all those those things in the drawers, people who are just policy wonks.
Right.
People can intellectualize this as much as they want, but when you really talk about the issue, right, it's issues of the heart, it's issues of the soul, and it's very, very personal. So the only way to have a really good conversation is to kind of know each other and build up a sense of trust to have those conversations. It doesn't happen immediately.
I also want to remind the community that we have a questionnaire that we distributed and that we have available through the end of the calendar year, so that people can do a self-reflection on where they are on the race and equity continuum. And I think we'll use that as one of the tools to open up conversations among ourselves. So if you don't know about the questionnaire, if you haven't looked at it yet, it will be available on the county website. So in wrapping up this conversation, he has this beautiful phrase for these times of tumult, which is looking for the spots of beauty in a storm. And that more than anything, I think, has stuck with me and resonated with me. As we close out, what are examples of the spots of beauty in the storm that each of you think about? What gets you through?
So I'm going to pick two. One, which is just an example of an organization that started up about 5 or 6 years ago, Arlington Neighborhood Villages, where people literally on their own spontaneously decided that they were going to reach out and help other people who might not be able to drive places or assist with tasks. And here, this is going to sound a little shameless, but it's really struck me. I was thinking about this last night. Beauty in the storm. I'm going to say WETA. And I know we started off with Sharon Rockefeller's comments, but if you think about it and listen to what she said, her mom and dad were in the community 80 years ago. She came here and she's for 30 years. WETA and all the work they do and the PBS family is a constant source for me of beauty in the middle of the storm. And I think that we don't want to lose that, especially in the kind of media environment we're in right now. So I think that I'm so happy that they're going to be staying in Arlington, and we worked really hard on that over the last 4 or 5 years, and a lot of thanks, obviously, to Libby and the board on that process. But I think that's worth mentioning.
That's terrific, Mark. Libby?
Yeah, I loved it the way Sharon talked to. I didn't know she had all those roots in Arlington. Of course, they're staying here. They're part of our family and our community, which is really, really special, very Arlington. For me, I keep coming back to, I think it's the Randolph PTA. We get so many examples, and I will tell you, I get, emails and seeing things in we get a lot of criticism from people. There are people that are upset, understandably so. But we also keep hearing about good things that are happening. They're like little sparks of light, that kind of keeps you going. And the Randolph PTA, they just keep going every week. They pull together bags of groceries and feed about 150, 250 families a week. And they've just kept going. And at one point, so Randolph is, of course, in a part of Arlington where they have a lot of families in their school community that need support. But and also Jamestown PTA, which they don't have many people with needed. They started putting together bags of groceries and bringing them to Randolph to distribute.
Right.
And it's just growing. It's just beautiful. It really is wonderful. And I think that's how I survived as an optimist at my age. I really focus on all of those positive things. That's my focus. And it really, that beauty in the eye of the storm helps us get through.
Yeah, I mean, it was just a beautiful phrase. And just back to the WETA influence, I grew up in Arlington, as both of you know, and I was an early viewer of WETA at Tuckahoe Elementary. The big TV would be rolled into the classroom one day a week for a French lesson. I didn't retain much, but it just speaks to its long-standing adherence and advocacy for education and culture and really celebrating the community. So kudos to WETA for their work and for their continued relationship with us. So as we wrap, I'd like to give each of you a chance for a final word as we launch into the next several months of building a community and looking for weavers.
Well, my final word would be that sometimes people underestimate their own power and their own ability to make change, and don't. I mean, if you have that spark, which both of you have mentioned, try to capture it and move ahead with it. And I'm an optimist. I think that there's an enormous amount of power in the individual working collectively in the community. So I'll just leave it at that.
Sounds great, Mark. Libby?
Yeah, I love that point, Mark. And you know, David Brooks talked about soul. We all have a soul. We're all, and everybody's got that spark in them. Everybody does. And we all just need to help. We in government need to help set the table. And just as individuals, do whatever we can to pull out and bring out that spark. You know, I keep thinking back to this children's movie, although it was for adults too, Cinderella, that came out about 5 or 6 years ago. Took my granddaughter to it, and it was a great kind of modern remake with a powerful Cinderella. But her theme was have courage and be kind. Have courage and be kind. And I think as we go into these courageous conversations and continue to get through this storm that is the pandemic, if we all have courage and are kind, we're going to be just fine.
And if we can be humble and gracious and, you know, frankly, just cut one another a little bit of slack, I think that goes a long way. I'm also on team optimism, and I look forward to the next several months. Thank you both for your conversation and thoughts this afternoon, and looking forward to the next chapter.
Thank you,
Diane. Thanks a lot.